Wonderful. So students, as you recently heard through our section that we just discussed, was systems thinking and why it matters. How do we scale? How do we make accountability, transparency, and communication prevalent in our organizations to ensure that we provide the best and safest care for our patients? So with me today, I have an expert in the space, Michelandi Ridori. So Michelandi Ridori is our Director of Quality for the Women's and Children's Hospital.
That's right.
But also, she is one of our experts on highly reliable organizations, which is a term that has been used widely in healthcare. It's also been used, and I think pioneered, in the military space.
Yeah, the Navy. Yeah.
In the Navy, in the airline industry. You know, a lot of times we ask, why is it that the airplanes aren't falling from the sky? They follow a lot of checklists.
That's right.
They follow systems thinking, and they're very reliable, right? We don't hear often that a plane falls from the sky. So Michelandi has been really our leader, helping us with scaling the concept of communication, transparency, and system thinking throughout our organization. And as you can imagine, in an organization with 15,000 plus employees, with lots of big business units, it may be difficult. Michelandi has had a tenured career here with our organization, lots of great successes, and she's taken this up as her calling to really support our patients in the journey for safe care. So with that, I'll kick it off to Michelandi, who's going to walk us through some of the important concepts around organizations that are highly reliable.
That's right. Thank you so much, Eddie, for the intro and for the opportunity to talk to you and your students here. As Eddie mentioned, I consider myself, really like a high reliability, like support system, right? And so my expertise really comes from having done this work in the hospital here and other hospitals across the East Coast. And so, as you mentioned before, you kind of brought up the Navy, right? And so the Navy or the military or airlines, they're commonly known as HRO. And as he alluded to, HRO, it stands for highly reliable organization. And so we're going to get into that because that's an example of systems thinking, which you previously just taught on. So what I would like to do is just kind of give you some examples of how all the concepts that Eddie already shared can be applied through this specific framework and the concepts. So as it sounds, a highly reliable organization typically has a lot of risks. When you think about hospitals, we have risks with patients. We've got risks with team members, right? Whether it's through violence or opportunities with like needle sticks, if you think about it. And so the risks they take a full gamut, right? They take a full spectrum of risks and they look at them and say, okay, if this organization has potential outcomes to harm, how do we prevent that? And how do we go a significant amount of time without getting one of those safety events? And so if you're designated as an HRO, you're able to go a long time without having one of those events. So now we've been working with Kaufman Hall and Vizient over the last year, specifically at Jackson Health System, with this specific framework that you see on the screen. And I won't go through the details of the framework because you've already covered those concepts with systems thinking. But what I wanted to do was show you guys how you could use this framework or the principles and really drill down and kind of level up some of the principles into actionable items in your organizations.
So quickly, Michelandi, so we have some of our students are vice presidents, some of them are directors, some of them are managers, and some of them are just influencing leaders within their units. When you say highly reliable organization, it sounds like a whole other language.
It's a buzzword, right?
It's a buzzword. And what is this HRO thing, right?
Yeah.
So it's a framework.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more, like, what do you mean by framework? Is it a way of, like, is it like an S-bar kind of, like, what is it?
Yeah, a framework, the way that I would see it is, if you have a destination, right? And your goal as a CEO is that you want really good outcomes for your patients. Your destination would be excellence, great outcomes, no bad events. The framework is actually the vehicle that gets you to your destination. And so I always think of the framework as I'm gonna sit in the car, but then there are specific elements that I have to do. I gotta put my AC on, I gotta turn my engine on. And so the framework will tell you, well, you have to have your engine at this level, your fuel at this level, and so on and so forth. And so I see it as like, if I were gonna go and run with HRO today, what do I need as my vehicle to get there? Does that help?
It makes complete sense.
Yeah.
So you're saying that anybody at any level can use this framework?
Yes, it doesn't matter if you're a bedside nurse, a technician, a vice president, a CEO, you can use this for your standing meetings with your administrative staff. Or if you're in the finance department, you can use that. You don't have to care for patients or be in the military to use it. In fact, you can go home today and say, how do I use this framework to make sure that my goal of being, let's say, the fittest person, right, in my neighborhood, you could say, okay, well, my vehicle for getting there is I'm gonna make sure that my gym bag is always packed and in my car. It's a highly reliable system. It means that every night you're gonna pack your bag, you're gonna put it in your car, and that means that whenever you're on your way back home, you're always gonna have something to help you, remind you to trigger to go to the gym.
I think what I love about this is that not only, it's a framework,
Yeah.
yes, but it's a framework that everyone is taught to understand.
Yeah.
So that if you do identify by a vehicle of people speaking up,
Yeah.
transparent communication, the best ideas come from the front lines,
Yeah.
that you can share that enterprise-wide or
Exactly.
system-wide, right?
Exactly.
Who cares if you provide a hot meal and it tastes delicious at
Yeah.
one restaurant,
Yeah,
but if at the other restaurants it's no good,
it's not reliable.
it's not reliable.
Exactly.
Close the restaurant, right?
Exactly.
So,
Right.
very similar to healthcare, or the aviation industry. It just takes one airplane to fall out of the sky.
Yeah.
It just takes one patient to have a bad outcome.
Yeah.
To really ruin it for the organization. So it's a nice framework to use to ensure that you're being reliable,
Hmm.
being consistent, but then also that you can scale it
Exactly.
amongst all the business lines.
Exactly. And there's the nice thing about a framework is it's almost like a car could be a Hyundai or it could be a Ferrari. So the type of car doesn't matter as much as the elements. It's going to have wheels, it's going to have a body, right? All those key things. So the framework gives you the structure for what to have. But if you want a Ferrari, you can drive a Ferrari, right? It's up to you how you design the tools that go along with the framework, if that makes sense.
I love that. All right, so let's get into it.
All right, absolutely. So when we talk about systems thinking, and you've kind of gone over this, if you're going to apply the framework, you can use the framework that Vizient has, or at the very least, you can apply it using these 5 principles, right? And some of these you've already mentioned with the data transparency aspect, right? And so what I wanted to focus on is, I'm going to explain what all 5 of these mean, but really I want us to kind of come away with examples of 2, right? 2 examples that apply to 4 of these frameworks, okay? So
can you also indulge our listeners, our students, in a lot of the lessons that we talked about is how do you display this to your front lines, right? How do you get people to speak up? How do you get people to have confidence in your new way of being, in communicating and being transparent? And what I've told the leaders is they have to walk the walk and talk the talk, and they need to see their team members as business owners.
Yes.
They are part owner of the business.
Absolutely.
How do you honor them? You share data.
Yeah.
You utilize boards.
Yeah.
You utilize huddles. You use SPAR. As you're walking us through this, can you give us a visual? What it looks like in a minute?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll give you some examples of each, so that it's a little bit more applicable, right?
Concrete.
Yeah, concrete.
You can see it.
Walk it, right? Because sometimes some of these things are a little bit over your head. You're like, I don't know how to apply that. So when we say that, so we'll go over the first one, sensitivity to operations. Really what it's saying is that in order to apply the framework, every person in that business unit, the clinical unit or the hospital has to understand what relevant systems are happening, right? So it's almost like, would you go into an ICU or maybe even the emergency department where there's an active trauma and go and interrupt and say, I'm going to just stop by and I want to come and have a meeting with everybody? You wouldn't. Why? Because you're sensitive to the fact that they are caring for patients in a traumatic situation that requires emergencies. So I think it's almost like reading the room, right? And so the way that you would apply that is you apply and you embed systems and processes based on the already existing ones. So if you said, hey, I want there to be no patient who leaves without medical advice, in your emergency department. And so sensitive to operations would be then asking, what gets in the way of them leaving? Okay, it's the duration of time that they wait in the waiting room. And so you're kind of thinking, okay, well, how do I prevent interruptions to that? Or how do I reduce redundancies to get that clear? So the goal there is that you can't expect an outcome on that unit without first understanding what gets in the way of the good outcome in the first place.
So you're saying if I'm a leader,
Yeah,
or if I'm a frontline person, or if I work in nutrition, or if I sweep the floors, I have to operate standing in the shoes of the person doing the work.
that's right. That's right. And you have to be sensitive enough, right? And so I'm glad you brought up nutrition. So in the pediatric emergency department, if our moms and dads are waiting with their children to see the doctor or to see the nurse for either a vital sign or something, or let's say an MRI, right? And so what will constantly happen is that they'll get hungry from waiting. Right now, we can't necessarily always affect the wait times, but we can impress or help them out with their experience. And so bringing in nutrition would be like ensuring they have food available, snacks available, right? To mitigate the situation. So you're like, you know what's happening on the unit. You know, like what gets in the way of a good day for a patient. How do we mitigate that? Being sensitive to those operations in that way.
Got it?
All right. So then the next one would be reluctance to simplify. Okay. So this is systems thinking in the complete nutshell. So what we do with reluctance to simplify is, let's say I told you, and we'll kind of get into it in a second, but let's say I told you all 90% of our newborns in the ICU are being admitted to the unit cold. Let's say they were being delivered in the operating room downstairs of the labor and delivery floor. What would you say is the root cause, and how would you solve that problem? We're gonna get into the solution, but just thinking in terms of that, how would you solve that problem?
Well, maybe the room is too cold to begin with.
Yeah.
Maybe there are not enough blankets.
Yes.
Maybe the mom is not covered enough.
Yes.
Could be anything, really. I don't know.
Yeah, no, and I'm so glad that you gave those suggestions, because that's exactly what teams think, right? And so we'll get into the example in a second, but reluctance to simplify, what we would do there is we'd say, let's go and see. Let's go and see what happens between the transfer of the patient, the delivery of the baby, to the transfer to the unit. Okay, maybe they're spending like 20 minutes in the elevator or on in the transport process.
Mm-hmm.
They're getting cold in the process, right? So there's opportunities for cooling, right, along the way. And so the OR is the immediate solution. When we say be reluctant to simplify, think beyond the OR.
Yeah, there's more.
There's way more layers to it, right? And so we'll kind of get into.
You could also be offensive by oversimplifying it.
And
right?
that's exactly what it is. And so sometimes when you really want to build a strong relationship with your team members with this framework, and you could say, hey, I noticed that you had CLABSIs on your unit. I want no more CLABSIs for the rest of the year. And so being reluctant to simplify is then asking what gets in the way of ensuring that our patients leave here without an infection that they acquired in the hospital. And then their team members can start to think and give you ideas about what's getting in the way. You know what? When we ordered labs, we realized that maybe the process of ordering them is getting in the way of our knowledge of when and where the infection came from. And so really the goal there is to say, I know that maybe the OR temperature is not the only reason why the patient is cold, right? Thinking beyond that.
One of our sessions, Michelin, before you arrived was, I shared with them around hospital-acquired infections at one of the facilities which I run. I was, nobody wants a hospital-acquired infection, but I was in a way happy that one happened, because it allowed us to bring the team together, everybody at every level, make them feel psychological safety to share and to speak up without fear of repercussion. They were, we tried to be sensitive to their operation. Sometimes there's a code going on. Sometimes they're short-staffed. Sometimes they don't have the right equipment. And even in then, they still have to draw the blood culture the right way.
Yeah.
We were also didn't want to simplify it for them. And what do you mean you can't? You're drawing the blood culture of a patient that maybe doesn't need it. Well, Eddie, we had an order, but we also didn't have the right equipment, but we also couldn't get a hold of the doctor, but we didn't. So I can already start seeing how these elements play a role in resolving issues, being transparent, and then most importantly, which is what the section's about, scaling
it up, right? And I know for you love standardization, and that's something that I've learned about you, is that once you find something good in one area, you're like, all right, make it the standard everywhere else. And so let's say you discovered that it wasn't the OR temperature and it was, let's say you mentioned the blankets. Let's say they're cold during the transportation process. So let's keep them warm, have them the blankets, maybe put a cap on them. And then you're going to go and you're going to spread that, right? And part of why you're spreading it is because you learned it worked in one area and you drill down, like, and I don't know if you've talked about root cause analysis before, but that's one method. So one method that we use often in order to prevent some oversimplifying things is to say, we're gonna ask why 5 times. It's literally called the 5 whys. It's a root cause analysis.
They're gonna hear from Monica about
She'll go over
the 5 whys.
Perfect. So I won't go into it. So, but essentially what you're doing is you're saying, okay, why is the baby cold? Okay, well, maybe the OR temperature was 2. Okay, but why was the OR temperature set at that cold temperature in the beginning? Well, because they had a previous case where the room was full of people and they wanted to cool it down. Well, why are there that many people in the room in the first place? So you're kind of drilling down, and then maybe you get down to the fact that there's going to be a set standard for the OR regardless, and a set standard for the volume of people in the room so it doesn't get too hot.
Got it.
And so that way you've now been reluctant to simplify it to just the temperature. You're now saying maybe there are too many bodies in the room in the previous case, so. So the next one, which you also alluded to, was preoccupation with failure. And we'll talk about one example that has worked really well across our health system and many other health systems in the industry, which is tiered huddling. Right. And so when we talk about scaling, if you're going to be preoccupied with failure, you need to know 2 things. The first thing is that talking about something that's wrong is not a bad thing, right? I think we have this lens of judgment, right? When we approach a failure and we're saying, oh man, something bad happened. But in the case of the HAI, had you not built that psychological safety with your team, they wouldn't be free to tell you, hey, you know what, Eddie, this got in the way.
In scaling it, Michelle, what we also did was we said, that idea of having the right kit wasn't mine.
Right.
It was Michael, the nurse.
Yes.
And the idea of using this type of wipe wasn't mine. Yeah. It was Jennifer, the tech.
Yeah.
And it made it okay for other people to say, hey, you've scaled this here. Can I give you another idea?
Yeah.
Can I tell you something else that's going on? It's made it safe.
Exactly.
And we are encouraging and rewarding people to communicate and to share the opportunities.
Yeah. And honestly, it makes your life easier, right? Because in the future, instead of saying, and not to say that you can't be present for these meetings and these task force around CLABSI prevention, but it makes your life easier in that you've now set the standard that people can speak about it. They can give you innovative ideas on how to solve it, and you don't even need to be in the room. It's gonna happen regardless if you're there, and they're still gonna bring you the innovation.
I have a motto, and I share with the students that I've never had a good idea. The only good idea I've ever had was listening to the people that had the right idea.
Yeah.
And it's my job to give those ideas the resources and the light to shine.
Absolutely.
And so in doing so, again, it's creating a psychologically safe environment to A, talk about the problems, but also B, what are the solutions?
Exactly.
You know?
And I don't know if you've started to see the theme here, right? So in sensitivity to operations, we're kind of talking about culture. In Reluctance to Simplify, you were building a culture where people didn't say, hey, it's one problem. With preoccupation with failure, we're saying, tell us about the failures. Tell us about the time where you almost had a failure and you didn't. You caught it, which is what a near miss is. And now, feel safe enough that this environment wants you to learn, grow, and evolve, and feel so safe that, hey, if something happened, you would go and tell people immediately, right? And so what you're noticing with this is that
someone's going to do something about it.
They're going to do something about it, right? And it's not going to be a slap on the hand, right? It's more so, tell me more. And so what you're seeing with the theme with systems thinking is you are building a culture where people feel mutual respect, not just horizontally, but vertically as well. I know my CEO respects me. My CEO respects my innovation. My CEO respects my creativity. And my CEO respects that there are things getting in the way of me doing the right thing.
100%.
I came in here to do the right thing, but there are things in my way, So with deference to expertise, I'm not going to even spend a lot of time on this because we've kind of touched on it, right? What it means is, in terms of scaling this up, is when you go and have that CLABSI prevention meeting, you're going to have your infection preventionists, your physicians, residents, you're going to have your nursing leaders, respiratory therapists, you're going to have anybody, maybe your pharmacist, anybody who could touch the process and system. And instead of saying, hey, here's the solution that we're going to pick, you're going to allow what you mentioned, the nurse and the tech, to come up with the solutions, right? So what we say is that the leaders at the top, they're not the ones who are going to come up with the problem. They're also not going to be the ones who are going to tell us what the problem is or the solution. And so when you drill that down, you push it all the way down to the ground, what you get is people at the front line finding a problem and solving it immediately. And that's the level of spread that you want. You want to get to the point where you're not calling them to say we've got a problem. They're calling you to say we found a solution.
Nice, I love that.
Yeah. And the last one is commitment to resilience. And why is this important? I mentioned it before, is that some of the metrics we track from a hospital and health system perspective is like level of violence, for instance, right? And the reason we do this is because when we think of safety, it's not just our patients who we want, to be safe. We also want our team members to be safe. And so we always want to make sure that they come in emotionally, physically, and mentally prepared to do really hard work. If you chose a healthcare career, you know it's going to be challenging, right? And so I have a friend who always says, "Don't be scared, be prepared." And so that is what I consider the commitment to resilience. And so what we do as a health system is we have a BERT team, right? We have BERT teams across the health system that are going to be there to respond to any behavior-related emergencies, right? And so the commitment to resilience is make sure people are emotionally, mentally, and physically prepared, but also train them in active shooter training. Train them on how to respond to a fire so that when a fire happens, they can respond with the knowledge that they've already gained, and it's kind of hardwired. But if there are things in place where you're thinking, hey, what would happen if we had a flood? What would happen if we had a thunderstorm? We're in Miami, that happens all the time. So we have those before, during, and after plans for evacuation. And so those types of things allow your team to be resilient to trauma and emergency things.
None of this happens without what?
Without teamwork, right?
Teamwork,
Yeah.
leadership.
Yeah.
People have to be walking the walk, talking the talk. This all looks great on paper, but if you don't have the team there enforcing it, you guys have done a great work now at, the huddles, leaders being at huddles, not just leaders at a hospital level, but senior executives being at the huddles, listening, valuing, and showing that this work is important.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. And actually, to your great point, we're the huddles is one example. So we kind of touched on it, but I wanted to go a little bit deeper just so you guys know, like, how do we take this from a screen, on a slide to actually operationalizing it? And so
some people that are listening work at a hospital, some work at clinics, some work at an insurance company. So what do you mean by huddle?
Yeah.
What is what? What is a
Yeah. So a huddle is it's a meeting that happens typically in a location on the business unit or where the work is happening. So if it's, as you mentioned, insurance, it could literally be a stand-up meeting by your water cooler, right? It could be a meeting out in front of a board. It could be a meeting virtually, right? You can have them virtually as well. A huddle is just a meeting where you have multiple disciplines, right? People of all different roles and types who are all gathering to communicate and escalate some sort of concern that's going to prevent you from being a highly reliable unit.
So they happen everywhere. So no excuse, students. It's happening whether you know it or not. It's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
Start of shift.
Yeah.
End of shift or during lunchtime, it's happening.
It's happening, exactly. And the nice thing about the huddle is that if you hear the term, it sounds very sports-like, right? That's kind of where it originated from. And so you would kind of see people kind of gathering together to try to come up with a plan. That's exactly what it is. So you gather together physically. I always say that a huddle, in my opinion, is people standing in a unit. And the reason you stand, it's kind of like why the McDonald's chairs are so uncomfortable, is because you got to get out there really quickly, right? In and out, right? And so my goal is always to be 10 minutes or less, right? Some people want a little bit more time, but I always say, meet with your team for 10 minutes and you'll engage their attention. Because once it, exceeds 10 minutes, people kind of get lost.
Like this class, this hour.
They're like, right, they're doodling, right? Taking phone calls. But with 10 minutes, you can capture the most important information. And the nice thing about this is that, and I'll go through each tier, but the nice thing about tiered huddle is that, let's say you're starting at the ground level, right? Let's say the techs or the nurses and residents are all meeting at their unit and they're saying, hey, what's gonna get in the way of a safe day is our Wi-Fi is down, which means then our, Wi-Fi dependent, vital sign machines can't really transfer data over to our EMR, right? And so now you're saying, okay, well, how do we escalate this? Then you escalate it to your hospital level huddle. At that level, you and your C-suite now become aware of a problem that maybe you weren't aware of. And then you're thinking, I'm a CEO and I also am the CEO of multiple hospitals. I wonder if it's happening in all my other hospitals, right? And then so then you escalate that to your executive level, and now your senior vice presidents are aware of a problem that they can help escalate and kind of deploy the right resources to go and resolve. The nice thing about this is it started at the ground level, which means you deferred to expertise. That goes back to the principle. You were preoccupied with failure. A question that we always ask in huddle is, what gets in the way of a safe day? Today, what's going to get in the way of one safe day today? And by asking something so simple, people would be like, you know what? I noticed there was a father that came into labor and delivery. He's a little agitated. I don't know if it's a problem, but I want to escalate it. And let's say on the off chance he is agitated and it becomes a physical altercation or interaction, you've now escalated to the point where they're paying attention to that and preventing it, right?
And others are become aware.
They become aware of it, right? And that's the nice thing, is that we're not waiting until it becomes a problem. We're a step ahead of that problem.
So at their core, these huddles, before you get into the different, is about transparency, communication,
That's right.
escalation culture.
Yes, culture especially.
Creating a speak up culture.
Yeah.
And ultimately involving leadership, right?
That's right. Yeah, and all levels. And honestly, and here's the thing about the tiered huddle system is that you need leaders. Whether you're a bedside nurse or a CEO, you need leaders who are going to be really modeling this work. And so when you first start to put this out there, some people might be a little resistant. And we expect that culture changes over time, but culture changes as a result of your leader, right? And so if, let's say the very first time you say, we're gonna have a unit huddle at our board, and I'll talk about the board in a second, and you're kind of like, hey, what's gonna get in the way of a safe day today? And it's just crickets. You're like, okay, well, there are no problems. Sometimes the issue is that the team members don't understand, they're not on the same page or speaking the same language as you. And so what I gave as an example of the Wi-Fi, they may not think that's a problem. That's not a safety concern. But over time, you're going to say, well, what I'm asking for is, if it's going to slow you down in your work, if it's going to cause a physical, mental, emotional problem in your patients or your team members, that's a safety concern. Bring it up, And so then you start to build a common language on your team, in your unit. And it goes back to the example that you had with the CLABSI. Once you escalate that one, agitated father, that one example of a safety concern, and it gets resolved and mitigated, people now hunger and thirst for it. But now they're going to tell you, oh my goodness, I got a hangnail, right? Like they start bringing up every issue, because now they realize that escalating concerns solves problems, and it gets people kind of thinking and resolving it. So let's go through the three tiers. As you can imagine, the unit huddle was tier 1. It always happens first. And that's where you gather physically at the board, standing, right, with your multiple disciplines. So again, it can be led by a nurse. It can be led by an attending physician, if that's who your physician leader is on the unit. And for the insurance company or first insurance team example, it could literally be the manager or the program manager or whoever it is at the physical location who's going to be leading the team if you have direct reports. Then you ask your direct reports or your team, what gets in the way, what safety issues do you have? Are there any bright ideas to solve them? What are our metrics? And then you kind of talk through them. The way that we do it at Jackson Health System is across our enterprise, we have 18 areas, and we're going to be expanding soon, that have a huddle board that is displayed exactly in the location where the huddle happens. So you're not just asking questions, you're now showing them with a visual, and you're asking, okay, what gets in the way of safe day? And someone has written it in. They've written in, well, what's getting in the way of safe day today is maybe a medication error, or maybe we're out of a specific type of medication that we know is an emergency med for our patients.
You know what I love about it is that, yes, you're discussing it when the time comes.
Yeah.
But people walk past that board all day long.
Yeah.
So they're thinking, medication error? Oh my God, I just had one the other day.
Yeah.
This just came up for me. Like, it gives them time to think about.
Process it. Yeah.
Right. And even the psychological safety,
Mhm.
that someone wrote it up there,
Mhm.
makes it okay for me to bring up the 2 or 3 times it may have happened to me.
Yes, exactly. And the nice thing is that like it's anonymous. Like no one knows that Peter, Paul, or Mary wrote that down. They just know that there's a safety concern up there.
Mm.
At some point, you can become more front and center and say, "Hey, I'm going to raise my hand and say I have a safety concern." But ultimately, in the beginning, like you can just write something up there and kind of scurry away. And the nice thing about it is you're giving people time who maybe don't feel psychologically safe to get to the level where they do, right? And so that's cultural shift. I will say again with the huddle boards, you're with any change in an organization, you're going to meet resistance. But when you give it to them and you say, "Hey, you're going to own this, design it how you want." We have some key elements that we want on there from a standardization perspective, but own it. You see the different colors that are on here. I love this one. It's from one of your floors, I think.
Yes.
And it's got all these colors. And I remember walking into the unit when I saw it and I was blown away because they made it their own. They identified, what gets people excited about it. And the leader who was presenting the board to me said she loves it. She loves it because now she knows, man, look at all our operational metrics that we're tracking.
I think that's the emergency room.
It is, yeah. So they get so excited about it, and so what I love about this is that now that translates up to the hospital level. And so let's say as a hospital, Eddie, you said we're going to focus on HAIs or we're going to focus on pressure injuries, whatever the case may be. So now the priority focus is going to trickle down to the units. They're going to pick one of those metrics and they're going to track it. In that middle column right there with the graphs, people start displaying data transparency.
Yep.
So when you build psychological safety, what you're saying to the team is we want to get better, but where we are is still okay because it gives us an opportunity to learn about where we, right?
And they're also business owners.
Yeah.
I don't think ever before we said, "Hey, this is how much we've collected.
Yeah.
This is how many falls we've had.
Yeah.
This is how many hospital-acquired infections we've had. This is how many X, Y, and Z's we've had." You are valuing their contribution and you're showing them that the work they do matters. You collect data on it.
100%.
Here's what it is.
And the data collection piece, oh my goodness, it is so empowering. I will say that piece is going to make the biggest impact regardless of what your business unit is. Whatever industry you're in, having leaders at the bedside or at the front line collect data on their own is going to tell you so much. So let me share with you really quickly an example. So we had team members that were saying, "Hey, you know what? We have a machine that's always always not available, or we don't have enough volume for them." And so they said, "Can we buy 10 to 15 more?" Now that 10 to 15 more is thousands of dollars. Now we're not opposed to capital, right? Like capital requests, but we want you to make what's the ROI on that, right? And so we asked them, before we go and purchase all these new equipment, start tracking how often you run into the problem of not having enough. Right. So they started tracking it, and literally we gave them a little grid, and we said there's gonna be one day for every column, and start tracking how many times on day 1, how many times on day 2 did that create a delay, how many times on day 3. So they started tracking it, and people started participating. There were these little dots in different colors on the board, and guess what happened? I came back to the unit and I asked, "Hey, I don't really notice any dots on the board. What happened?" They're like, "I guess it wasn't as big a problem as we thought it was." Right? And so the nice thing about letting them own the data is that when they come to you for a request, they are providing you either with irrefutable evidence that it is a problem, or maybe it's confirming with them, maybe you had a little bit of a bias and I think it's a bigger problem than it actually is, you know? So that's the nice thing about that. So you've, at this point, you've spread this, people are meeting regularly, every day around 7 a.m. or 7 p.m., whatever the time for your huddle is. And every day you're going to have a tier 2 huddle. So now that huddle is going to happen with your hospital leaders. So it will be your director level team, your C-suite, and people from all your other disciplines. In a hospital, it might be your engineer. And you guys have a beautiful huddle where you actually have data on the screen. You're looking at all that as well, right?
Yeah, so we do one at each one of my hospitals, one hospital at 8, the other one at 8:30. I mean, it literally lasts 15 minutes. It gives people a chance to give announcements, but more importantly, we look at the data.
Yeah.
We share anything that was shared at maybe one of these tiered huddles. We talk about opportunities, and we also talk about any sort of outcomes that happened and opportunities that we already know of. It also allows us on the following day to circle back.
Yeah.
Right, to close the loop on what we may have identified or not identified. And again, what you track and monitor, I feel like you succeed at.
Yeah.
So how do we hold people accountable to, length of stay, to imaging times, to being seen in the emergency room quickly, if we're not looking at the data every day?
Exactly. What you right, like what you
What you expect.
you inspect what you
What you
expect.
expect, correct.
Exactly. I love that phrasing. One of our nursing leaders uses it all the time, and I always ask her, "How do you get your team to do everything that you've asked them to do?" And she's like, "They know what my expectations are because I look every single day." And that's what you've done, right? So your huddle is like, if you want to see a textbook huddle, like it's yours, right? And I love the fact that everyone kind of runs on cadence, right? So one person shared their screen and they showed their data, and then as soon as they were done, the next person rolled. Why? Because he's got a highly reliable system. And so it runs like a well-oiled machine. Whether he's here or not, it's going to still run.
Yeah, it's, whether I tell them that we run a flat organization because everybody is the same level. And so if I'm not on, if the CNOs, anybody can run it.
Yeah.
Because people submit their data and they're talking about their own data. I wouldn't pretend to talk about another unit that I don't know about.
Yeah, that's very true. It's very true. So at this point now, your C-suite and your directors are aware about what those concerns are. So they've collated them, and at your 10 a.m. huddle, which is your executive huddle, now you're talking with other CEOs, other SVPs about what are the big ticket items that are getting in the way. So if it happens to be the Wi-Fi that's down on multiple hospitals, if it happens to be a potential threat, like an emergency threat, now that people are aware, and we can mitigate a lot faster with more arms and the people at the system level who can kind of take care of that. So that's an example of how you would be preoccupied with failure, data transparent, be sensitive to operations, right? And I think also building psychological safety allows you to build a commitment to resilience as well. Right? And then the other example, we kind of touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to show you like what we came up with as a result of this, right? So in the beginning of 2 fiscal years ago, we noticed an issue with our temperature, the temperatures of our neonatal patients coming into the NICU, right? So these newborns, typically, these are patients, we're gonna, for the sake of this population, we're gonna say they were delivered in one of our operating rooms. I alluded to it before. And so our nurses and our team members, our managers and directors started thinking about this, and they were saying, okay, we think that for the most part, there might be an issue with our polyurethane bags, right? And so they started to investigate that. Nothing really changed. There's still a lot of variation in our data. Our rates were still low. Then, exactly as you suspected, they said, I wonder if it's the OR temperature. So they went back to the ORs and they're saying, from now on, we're going to set our OR to between 68 and 72 degrees, right? And so look what happened right after they did that. Then our average temperature for our patients started to go back down. So we're saying, wait a second, we think that they're too cold in the operating room before they come. Why is our average rate going down? So then they said, okay, maybe it's when they're being transferred to the unit. Let's give them hats. So they started giving them hats, putting little hats on the babies and saying, all right, we're gonna make sure the temperature in the OR is at a certain temperature, and we're gonna give them hats so that way when they're being transported to the NICU, they'll be okay. Okay, so then what happened was we decided to just defer to the nurses. We said, from now on, we want you to be responsible for taking that first admission temperature and let us know what the temperature is. So the nurses started tracking it. But then what they noticed was for baby A, the temperature was this, and then they used a different monitor or a different thermometer and realized it was a different temperature. And they're like, are we sure we're using a consistent process on how to monitor the patient's temperature? And come to find out, that was the issue. The issue was the temperature that they were being monitored with in the operating room was a different temperature than we were using in the NICU. And there were different thermometers, different brands of thermometers all throughout the NICU. And the NICU is very large, right? And so we can have as many as over 100 patients in our unit in a given day. And so what the nurses, who are the ones caring for the patients, who are the ones taking the temperature on admission, said, can we just get, and I think it was like BD, it was like a very simple like CVS brand, thermometer. Can we just use this consistent thermometer and let's place it at the bays in every single bay across the unit? And guess what happened? So immediately after the new thermometers were implemented, we went over our goal of 90%, and we've been consistently over 90% for the last several months.
Wow.
And that's more recent data. So you can kind of see that whole being reluctant to simplify thing. Now, is it wrong to think that the OR was a contributing factor? No, it's the most obvious one, right? And had we not taken care of the OR, we might still have problems, right, with kids coming back cold. But what we realized was that the OR was just one issue. When we found out what was really contributing to it, it was how we were measuring the temperature and then ensuring that the child does not lose body heat along the way.
Nice, I love that.
Yeah. So that's really what I had in terms of examples, but I'm happy to talk through more examples if you have them off the top of your head.
So talk to us a little bit about scaling things,
Yeah.
right? So you have your meetings,
Mhm.
you have your huddles, you are using the HRO framework. So how does someone take what, like, for example, this NICU case
Mhm.
and scale that system wide? Is there a forum that people
Yeah.
take that to? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, that's great. And so my recommendation in using the framework is to create a standard forum, right? And so for us, we use our performance improvement and continuous improvement meeting to do that. And so what we would typically ask is that now the leader for this unit, the director and the nurse manager and the physicians involved, whoever was involved, go and present that at the health system level, showcase what you learned from this, and then ask team members, hey, can we partner on this? Can we create an algorithm or a guideline that says from now on, everyone in the health system is going to use this one thermometer for patients of this population. And so when it comes to HRO, my goal is to create this thing called a learning collaborative.
Mhm.
And so we want to launch that in October, where across the health system, if you're part of a learning area or if you have a huddle board and you've learned something, come and showcase it. And that way we can say, as to use your word, cross-pollinate, right? And spread that and say, hey, I love, one example was you have a traveling medicine box
Mhm.
for every patient. I would love to use that in everywhere across the system. And now it gives the leader an opportunity not just to showcase their innovation, but to feel so proud of the work that came out of you building psychological safety on the unit. So in terms of scaling, I always say, when we first started our huddles, it was really just initially just our units and then our hospital ones, right? But then they standardized that executive one a couple of years ago.
Yep.
And so what we have found is that, and I think our senior vice presidents and our presidents of our health system realize the hospitals are already doing this work. How do we keep moving this up so that way we're aware we have like cross-pollination, as you mentioned, across our health system? So they created that 10 o'clock huddle. And so in order to spread, my suggestion is always to build relationships with people who are in similar roles across your industry. So for the women's hospital, whenever we have an innovation in our women's hospital or a women's unit, we call Anna who's the women's health director for Jackson North. We say, hey, we just implemented this. What do you think? Do you want to use it as well?
Right.
And then they kind of do the same thing. So relationship building, even beyond your team, teamwork and collaboration means that not only am I going to see my team succeed, but I'm going to see my team as part of the global system as well.
I love that.
Yeah.
Last question, how do our students
Mhm.
and leaders show up in a way that encourages this work?
Yeah.
That encourages transparency, open communication, psychological safety, all of which this program entails? How can they show up differently?
Yeah, the one thing I will say is for this framework, if I were to take one major takeaway, walk into the room every single day saying, I'm going to have non-negotiable mutual respect for every person I interact with. And that's really how you spread that. And so regardless of your industry, your title, if I'm going to say, I'm going to work with my director, my direct report, or an A&M or a tech, or somebody from environmental services or engineering, I'm going to say, how do I respect this human being as if they were my mother, my father, or my child? And if you operate that way with that expectation, they're going to give it back to you as well. And that's what builds psychological safety.
Love that. You heard it first here from Miss Shalandi, our resident expert.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much. See you next lesson.